The morning of May the 4th, 1932, began like any other spring day in Stockholm. Sunlight filtered through the budding trees lining Atlasvägen, a respectable street in the city's southern district where young professionals and working families made their homes. But inside apartment 35, something waited that would shatter the city's carefully maintained image of Nordic civility and order. When the landlady knocked on Lilly Lindeström's door that Wednesday afternoon, she expected nothing more unusual than collecting the overdue rent. The 32-year-old woman had been a reliable tenant, quiet and punctual, until recently. But the silence that greeted her persistent knocking carried a weight that made her pause, her hand hovering over the door handle. What she found when she finally entered would become the stuff of nightmares, a discovery so disturbing that even hardened police investigators would struggle to describe it without their voices faltering. Lilly Lindeström lay on her bed, arranged with an almost ceremonial precision that suggested something far more calculated than simple violence. Her body had been completely drained of blood, not spilled, not scattered across the room in the chaotic spray pattern of a frenzied attack. Drained, methodically and thoroughly emptied, as if her killer had approached the task with the patience of someone performing a sacred ritual. Beside her corpse sat a common kitchen ladle, its presence both mundane and profoundly unsettling. The door showed no signs of forced entry. The windows remained locked from the inside. Whoever had done this had been invited in, or possessed a key, or somehow convinced Lilly to open her door to the person who would orchestrate this grotesque tableau. And in the weeks that followed, as investigators pieced together the final days of Lilly's life, they would discover details that defied rational explanation. Mysterious phone calls, a strange visitor whose description seemed to shift depending on who was asked, and evidence of a blood ritual so bizarre that some wondered if Stockholm had become home to something that belonged more to folklore than to the modern world of 1932. The morning light filtered through the narrow streets of Atlasvägen in Stockholm's Kungsholmen district, catching the frost that clung to window panes in the winter of 1934. In a modest apartment building at number 31st, a woman named Lilly Lindeström had carved out a solitary existence, her life a testament to the quiet desperation that marked so many during those Depression years. She was 32 years old, though those who knew her said she could look both younger and older depending on the light, depending on the day. Her real name, the one given to her at birth, was Greta, but she had long since abandoned that identity for reasons known only to herself. The Gatekeeper, a man named Erik Lundberg, would later become the most important witness to her final days. He occupied a small lodge near the building's entrance, a position that afforded him an intimate knowledge of the comings and goings of every resident. For nearly 3 years, he had observed Lilly with the kind of attention that comes from long hours of solitude and the natural human tendency toward curiosity. He described her as polite, always offering a small nod when she passed. Sometimes a quiet greeting in a voice that carried the subtle accent of someone not originally from Stockholm. She had come from Gävle, he believed, though she never spoke much of her past. The apartment she occupied was on the 3rd floor, accessed by a narrow stairwell that smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and coal smoke. The building itself was typical of working-class Stockholm in that era. Its red brick facade darkened by decades of industrial soot, its courtyards enclosed and shadowed even at midday. Her rooms consisted of a single large chamber with a smaller kitchen alcove tucked into one corner. A window facing the courtyard provided limited light, and neighbors would later recall that she often kept her curtains drawn, even during the day. The furniture was sparse, but maintained with evident care. A narrow bed with an iron frame stood against one wall, covered with a worn quilt in faded floral patterns. A small table with 2 mismatched chairs occupied the center of the room. A wardrobe, its mirror slightly cracked, held her modest collection of clothing. On a shelf near the window, she kept a few books, their titles suggesting a mind that sought escape. A collection of poetry by Karen Boye, a novel by Selma Lagerlöf. These details would emerge later as police cataloged her possessions, transforming a life into an inventory. The social context of sex work in 1930s, Stockholm was one of official disapproval layered over practical tolerance. Prostitution itself was not illegal, but the laws surrounding it created a web of vulnerability. Women who sold their bodies could not be arrested for the act itself, but they could be charged with disturbing the peace, with soliciting in public spaces, with violating ordinances about moral conduct. The police maintained registries, conducting regular health inspections that were as much about surveillance as disease prevention. For women like Lilly, this meant existing in a gray zone, neither wholly criminal nor wholly legitimate, always aware that their safety depended on the discretion of clients, the tolerance of neighbors, and the whims of authorities who could, at any moment, decide to enforce regulations more strictly. Lilly's clients came to her, according to witnesses. She did not walk the streets like some of the younger women who worked near Central Station or in the parks after dark. Her business was conducted behind closed doors, arrangements made through quiet recommendations, through networks that operated below the surface of respectable society. The gatekeeper Eric later admitted, with evident discomfort, that he had been aware of the nature of her work. How could he not be? He saw the men who came at irregular hours, who climbed the stairs with caps pulled low, who left after intervals that were neither social visits nor business calls in any conventional sense. But he had never reported her, never caused trouble. In Depression-era Sweden, many people did what they needed to survive, and judgment seemed a luxury when so many were struggling. In the weeks before her death, Eric recalled that Lilly had maintained her usual routine with remarkable consistency. She rose late, typically around 10 or 11 in the morning. He would see her descending the stairs in the early afternoon, dressed modestly in a dark coat and practical shoes, her hair pinned back in a simple style. She shopped at the local market on Atlasvägen, where the vendors knew her as a quiet customer who examined produce carefully and counted her coins with precision. She bought what she needed for simple meals: potatoes and root vegetables, sometimes a small piece of fish or a bit of pork, coffee, which was expensive but which she never went without, bread from the baker on the corner, who would later tell police that she had seemed entirely normal, neither anxious nor distressed. The neighborhood itself was a place of narrow streets and modest ambitions, where factory workers and low-level clerks lived alongside seamstresses, maids, and others who comprised Stockholm's working poor. Atlasvägen sat at the edge of respectability, not quite slum but far from the elegant districts where diplomats and merchants maintained their households. Children played in the courtyards when weather permitted, their shouts echoing off brick walls. Women hung laundry on lines strung between buildings, the frozen sheets snapping in the wind during winter months. Men gathered at corner taverns after work, seeking warmth and camaraderie over cheap beer. It was a community where people knew each other by sight, if not by name, where privacy was both valued and nearly impossible. Several neighbors would later provide accounts of Lilly's final week. The woman who lived directly below her, a widow named Mrs. Anderson, reported hearing nothing unusual. No arguments, no sounds of struggle, no indication of distress. The apartment had been quiet, as it typically was during daytime hours. Another resident, a young man who worked night shifts at a printing press, mentioned seeing Lilly on the stairs 4 days before her body was discovered. She had been carrying a bag of groceries, and they had exchanged polite nods as they passed. He remembered thinking she looked tired, but then, everyone looked tired in those days. Eric the gatekeeper provided the most detailed timeline. On Friday, the 26th of January, 1934, he saw Lilly leave the building around 2 in the afternoon. She returned approximately 3 hours later, alone, carrying her usual shopping bag. That evening, he noted 3 separate visitors to the building who he believed went to her apartment, though he could not be certain. The first arrived around 7, the second near 9, the third close to 11. All 3 were men he did not recognize, which was not unusual. Her clientele changed regularly, drawn from various parts of the city. The following day, Saturday the 27th, he did not see her leave the building, but again noted visitors in the evening. Sunday was quiet. He saw no one enter or leave from her apartment. Monday passed similarly. By Tuesday, he began to feel a vague sense of unease, though he could not articulate why. What made Eric finally raise concern was not dramatic intuition but something mundane. On Wednesday morning, he noticed that mail had accumulated in her box near the entrance. Lilly always collected her mail promptly. By Thursday, when the pile had grown and a faint smell began to emanate from the upper floors, he decided to contact the building supervisor. Together they climbed to the third floor, knocked repeatedly on her door, and receiving no answer, used the master key to enter. What they found would transform Lilly Lindeström from a living woman, with routines and preferences and dreams, into a victim, a case file, a cautionary tale. But in the days before that door opened, she had been simply herself, a woman who read poetry and counted her coins, who greeted her gatekeeper with quiet nods, who navigated the complex economy of survival in a city that offered limited options to women of her class and circumstances. She had made her small apartment into a home, had established a routine that provided structure to uncertain days. She had existed in that liminal space occupied by so many during the 1930s, neither wholly visible nor entirely invisible, making do with what opportunities presented themselves. The Depression had created a Stockholm of contrasts, where gleaming modernist buildings rose alongside medieval alleyways, where new ideas about social welfare competed with old prejudices about morality and worth. For women selling sex, the era was particularly precarious. They were simultaneously condemned and tolerated, pathologized as diseased vectors requiring medical supervision, while also being tacitly acknowledged as providing a service for which there was steady demand. Lilly had navigated this contradiction with apparent competence for years, maintaining her independence, paying her rent, staying beneath the threshold of official attention, until she could not. The gatekeeper noticed him first. It was late on the evening of May 1st, 1932, when the man approached the entrance to Lilly Lindeström's apartment building on Kammargatan. The gatekeeper, a woman named Esther Blomqvist, had worked at the building for nearly 7 years by that point, and she prided herself on knowing every resident, every regular visitor, every delivery person who passed through her domain. This man was none of those things. In her testimony to police, given just days later when the weight of what she had witnessed fully settled upon her, Esther described him with remarkable precision. He was of medium height, she said, perhaps 170 centimeters, with a lean build that suggested neither particular strength nor weakness. His hair was dark and slicked back in the fashion of the time, and he wore a long overcoat despite the mild spring weather. She remembered that detail particularly because it had struck her as odd, as unnecessary. The temperature that evening had been pleasant, warm enough that most Stockholmers had shed their heavy winter layers weeks before. But it was his face that stayed with her, she would later tell investigators. Not because it was particularly memorable in any distinctive sense, but because of its very ordinariness, its complete lack of remarkable features. He had a thin face, clean-shaven, with what she described as neutral features that seemed to resist description, even as she looked directly at him. Years later, criminologists studying the case would note this phenomenon, how certain individuals seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to appear forgettable, to slide through memory like water through fingers. What struck Esther most forcefully, however, was his demeanor. He did not hesitate at the entrance. He did not pause to check an address or look up at the building numbers as strangers typically did. He did not approach her with the usual questions visitors asked. Instead, he walked through the entrance with the confidence of someone who had been there 100 times before, someone who knew exactly where he was going and required no assistance to get there. Esther called out to him. It was her job, after all, to monitor who came and went. The building housed respectable people, working professionals, and it was her responsibility to maintain a certain standard of security. But the man merely turned his head slightly, offered the briefest of nods, and continued walking toward the staircase that led to the upper floors. His shoes made sharp clicking sounds on the polished floor, a rhythm that Esther would remember in the sleepless nights that followed. She watched him ascend, his hand trailing along the banister with familiar ease. He did not count floors or pause to check apartment numbers. He climbed with purpose, and when he reached the third floor, where Lilly Lindeström's apartment was located, he turned down the corridor without hesitation. Esther could not see him any more after that, but she heard no knocking, no sound of inquiry. If he knocked at all, it must have been so softly that it did not carry down the stairwell. The time, according to Esther's best recollection, was approximately 10:30 in the evening. Later, investigators would press her on this detail. Was she certain of the hour? Could it have been earlier or later? But Esther remained firm. She had looked at the clock on the wall behind her desk shortly before the man arrived, noting that her shift would end in 90 minutes. 10:30, she insisted. Perhaps 25 past or 25 to 11, but no more variance than that. Another witness emerged during the investigation, a neighbor named Henrik Anderson, who lived in the apartment directly below Lilly's. Henrik was a bank clerk, a meticulous man with precise habits and an excellent memory for detail. He told police that he had been sitting in his living room that evening, reading the newspaper and enjoying a pipe before bed. At some point between 10:30 and 11, he heard footsteps in the apartment above him, footsteps that were distinctly heavier than Lilly's light tread. Henrik knew the sound of Lilly's movements well. She was a small woman, petite in build, and her footsteps made only the softest impressions on the floorboards above. These sounds were different. They were the footsteps of a man, he was certain, someone with a heavier gait and a more substantial presence. He heard the muffled sound of voices, though he could not make out any words. The walls in these older Stockholm buildings were thick, built in an era when privacy and sound insulation were valued, and so the voices came through as nothing more than a low murmur, a back-and-forth exchange that suggested conversation rather than argument. What Henrik remembered most clearly, what he emphasized repeatedly in his statement to police, was that nothing about these sounds suggested distress. There was no raised voice, no cry for help, no sound of struggle or conflict. Just conversation, ordinary and unremarkable. At some point, the footsteps ceased, the voices faded, and Henrik returned his attention to his newspaper. He went to bed around midnight, he told investigators, and heard nothing more throughout the night. This absence of sound would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. Whatever happened in Lilly Lindeström's apartment during those hours, it happened quietly. There was no scream that pierced the night, no furniture overturned in struggle, no desperate pounding on walls or doors. The neighbors on either side of her apartment, when interviewed, reported hearing nothing unusual. The woman who lived across the hall had already been asleep by 10 o'clock and heard nothing at all. The man was seen leaving early the next morning. This time, the witness was a different tenant, a schoolteacher named Margit Eklund, who was preparing to leave for work. She encountered him in the stairwell at approximately 6:15 in the morning on May 2nd. He was descending the stairs at a normal pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling, and he wore the same long overcoat she had noticed him wearing the previous evening when she had glimpsed him passing her door. Margit nodded to him politely, as was customary when encountering neighbors or their guests, but the man did not acknowledge her greeting. He did not meet her eyes. He simply continued down the stairs and out of the building. Margit thought little of it at the time. People were often distracted in the morning, preoccupied with the day ahead. It was only later, when police came asking questions, that the encounter took on sinister significance in her memory. Esther Blomqvist, who had begun her morning shift at 6 o'clock, saw him exit the building. She recognized him immediately as the man from the previous evening, the one who had passed her station with such unsettling confidence. She noted the time, 6:15, and watched through the window as he walked away down Kammarkaregatan, heading in the direction of Odengatan. He walked at a steady pace, his hands in his coat pockets, his posture relaxed and unhurried. Within moments he had turned the corner and disappeared from view, dissolving into the morning flow of pedestrians heading to work, to markets, to the ordinary business of their ordinary lives. No one realized yet that anything was wrong. No one knew that up on the 3rd floor, in apartment number 12, Lilly Lindeström was already dead. Her body would not be discovered until later that afternoon, when her employer, concerned by her uncharacteristic absence from work, sent someone to check on her. The question that would haunt investigators, that would generate endless speculation and theory, was simply this: who was he? This man who came in darkness and left at dawn, who moved through the building with such easy familiarity, who seemed to know exactly where Lilly lived without asking directions or checking addresses. This man who spent the night in her apartment, whose presence generated no alarm, no cry for help, no sound of violence or struggle. The physical description provided by the witnesses was maddeningly generic. Medium height, dark hair, thin face, unremarkable features, long overcoat. It could have described 10,000 men in Stockholm at that time. Police would eventually compile a list of Lilly's known acquaintances, male colleagues, former suitors, anyone who might have had reason to visit her apartment. But none of them matched both the physical description and the timing. None of them could be placed at the scene during those crucial hours between 10:30 on May 1st and 6:15 on May 2nd. Some witnesses, when pressed, mentioned an element they could not quite articulate, a quality about the man that existed beyond physical description. Esther Blomqvist, in one of her later statements, struggled to explain it. "There was something about the way he moved," she said, "something about his certainty and his silence that felt rehearsed, calculated, as if he had planned every step, every movement, every detail of his visit. As if he were an actor performing a role he had studied carefully." The silence of that night became its own kind of evidence. Whatever happened in apartment 12 occurred without violence, or at least without the kind of violence that announces itself through sound. There was no struggle that rattled windows, no fight that sent furniture crashing, no moment when Lily's voice rose in fear or protest loud enough for her neighbors to hear. The walls that had carried the heavy footsteps and the murmur of conversation carried nothing else. No warning, no alarm, just ordinary domestic sounds, followed by silence, by sleep, by death. Investigators would spend weeks trying to reconstruct those hours, to understand what could have transpired in that apartment that left no auditory trace, no acoustic evidence of crime or struggle. The very quietness of it suggested either swift efficiency or something darker, more insidious. Perhaps Lily knew her killer well enough to feel no fear until it was too late. Perhaps she trusted him enough to let him stay, to believe herself safe even as danger settled into her home like fog through an open window. The mystery man was never identified. Despite extensive police work, despite appeals in newspapers and interviews with hundreds of potential witnesses, no one ever came forward with information that led to his identity. He remained what he had been from the beginning, a shadow passing through the testimony of witnesses, a figure described but never known, never caught, never made to answer for what happened during those silent hours when Lilly Lindeström drew her last breath. The morning of May 4th arrived cold and gray over Sacramento, casting a pallid light through the windows of apartment 21 at 1600 F Street. When Detective Ron Miller first stepped across the threshold at 9:47 that morning, responding to a call from a worried landlord about an uncollected rent check and an unusual smell, he expected to find what veteran homicide investigators often find in such situations. Perhaps an elderly tenant who had died alone. Perhaps evidence of a burglary gone wrong. What he encountered instead would become the case that would haunt him for the remainder of his 30-year career. The apartment itself presented a peculiar contradiction that immediately unsettled the responding officers. There was no chaos, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass or splintered door frames. The small living space appeared almost serene in its orderliness. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on the kitchen counter, a faint ring of dried liquid at its base, suggesting it had been there for several days. Mail lay neatly stacked on a side table near the door. A television remote rested on the arm of a worn sofa, positioned exactly as someone might place it after an evening of quiet viewing. Everything suggested normalcy, domestic routine, the ordinary rhythms of a solitary life. Everything except the bedroom. Lily Gray lay on her bed, positioned with an unnatural precision that immediately struck investigators as deliberate staging. Her body rested supine, arms arranged carefully at her sides, palms facing upward in a pose that Detective Miller would later describe as almost ceremonial. Her legs were straight, ankles together, forming a rigid alignment that no one assumes naturally in sleep or even in death. Someone had arranged her this way, had taken time to position her limbs with meticulous care. Her eyes were closed, her expression peaceful, almost serene. If not for the waxy, translucent quality of her skin, she might have appeared to be sleeping. But that skin told a story that defied everything the seasoned investigators thought they understood about death. Lily Gray was not simply pale. Her flesh had taken on a quality that the first officer on scene struggled to articulate in his initial report. He finally settled on describing it as looking like porcelain, like alabaster, like something crafted rather than born. Every visible inch of her skin had transformed into a shade, somewhere between chalk white and the faint blue-gray of skim milk. Her lips, which photographs from just days earlier showed as naturally pink, were now the color of old newspaper. The beds of her fingernails, typically flush with the pink hue of circulating blood, were utterly colorless, translucent enough to see the pale flesh beneath. Crime scene photographer David Chen, who had documented hundreds of death scenes throughout Sacramento County, later testified that he had never encountered a corpse with this particular appearance. Bodies drained of blood through trauma, through bleeding out from violent wounds, still retained some color, some residual hue in the tissues. But Lilly Gray looked as though every drop of blood had been systematically extracted from her body, leaving behind an empty vessel. The medical examiner, Dr. Robert Thornton, arrived at 11:30 that morning. A man not given to dramatic statements or emotional reactions, he nonetheless paused for several long moments at the bedroom doorway before approaching the body. His preliminary examination at the scene revealed findings that would only deepen as the autopsy progressed. Her skin felt different beneath his gloved fingers. Not simply cold, which all bodies become after death, but somehow lighter, as though the substance beneath the surface had been fundamentally altered. When he pressed gently against her forearm, testing for rigor mortis and tissue response, the flesh gave way with an emptiness he had never before encountered. Most disturbing was the complete absence of livor mortis, the purplish-red discoloration that normally appears on the lowest parts of a corpse as blood settles due to gravity after the heart stops beating. In a body lying on its back, this would typically manifest along the shoulders, buttocks, and backs of the legs. Lilly Gray showed no livor mortis whatsoever. Nowhere on her body could Dr. Thornton detect the telltale signs of settled blood. It was as if her circulatory system had been emptied so thoroughly that no blood remained to pool anywhere. On the nightstand beside the bed, positioned with the same deliberate care as the body itself, sat a large metal ladle. Not a kitchen spoon or serving utensil, but a substantial ladle, the kind used for transferring soup or stew from pot to bowl. Its bowl measured perhaps 4 inches across and 2 inches deep, its long handle extending nearly a foot. The ladle rested precisely in the center of the nightstand, placed perpendicular to the edge, as though its position mattered greatly to whoever had left it there. The metal surface gleamed dully in the morning light, showing no signs of blood, no fingerprints, no trace evidence of any kind. It had been cleaned thoroughly, methodically, before being staged in this specific location. The ladle became an object of intense focus for investigators. Why place it there? What message was the killer attempting to convey? The symbolism seemed both obvious and obscure. A ladle transfers liquid from one container to another. A ladle portions out, measures, serves. Was this some grotesque reference to the removal of Lilly's blood? Some signature left by a killer who wanted investigators to understand exactly what had been done? Detective Miller and his team began their methodical documentation of the scene, photographing every surface, every object, every detail before anything could be moved or disturbed. They searched for signs of forced entry and found none. The door showed no damage to its lock or frame. The windows were all secured from the inside, their latches engaged, their glass intact. Whoever had killed Lilly Gray had either possessed a key or had been admitted willingly by the victim herself. They searched for evidence of struggle, for the chaos that typically accompanies violent death. Nothing. No defensive wounds on Lilly's hands or forearms. No torn fingernails suggesting she had clawed at an attacker. No bruising around her throat, no trauma to her head, no signs of sexual assault. Her clothing, a simple nightgown, remained undisturbed, properly arranged, showing no tears or disarray. She appeared in every respect except her horrifying pallor to have died peacefully in her sleep. But the most confounding aspect of the crime scene was the blood, or rather its complete and utter absence. A human body contains approximately 5 to 6 quarts of blood, roughly 10 to 12 pints. All of that volume existed somewhere until Lilly Gray died. The medical evidence would later confirm that virtually every drop had been removed from her corpse. So where had it gone? Investigators searched the apartment with increasing bewilderment. They examined the bathroom, looking for bloodstains in the tub, the sink, the toilet. Nothing. They inspected the kitchen, checking the drain traps, the disposal, every pipe and surface. Clean. They pulled up sections of carpet, looking for saturation that might indicate blood had been spilled and cleaned up. The fibers showed no such evidence. They examined the walls with luminol, a chemical that reveals blood residue invisible to the naked eye. In the eerie blue glow of the luminol reaction, the walls remained dark. No blood. They checked closets, crawl spaces, every conceivable location where containers of blood might have been hidden. They found nothing. They searched for tools that might have been used to drain a human body, medical equipment, tubing, anything that suggested how such a feat might have been accomplished. Again, nothing. The apartment yielded no secrets, no evidence, no trace of the massive volume of blood that had once sustained Lily Gray's life. Dr. Thornton's autopsy, conducted the following day at the county morgue, provided clinical confirmation of what investigators already knew and deepened the mystery considerably. The incisions he made during the examination revealed tissue that was disturbingly dry, organs that appeared desiccated, blood vessels that were completely empty. When he opened the thoracic cavity, he found a heart that contained no blood in any of its chambers. The lungs, the liver, the spleen, all the organs that normally hold substantial blood volume, were utterly exsanguinated. He found no wounds that would account for this drainage. No puncture marks on the major arteries. No incisions hidden in the folds of skin. No evidence that the body had been suspended or positioned to facilitate gravitational drainage. The femoral arteries in the legs, the carotid arteries in the neck, the subclavian arteries beneath the collarbones, all were intact. There were no visible means by which the blood could have been removed, yet removed it had been, with a thoroughness that defied medical explanation. The toxicology screens showed nothing unusual. No drugs that might have thinned the blood or prevented clotting. No poisons that might have caused massive internal hemorrhaging. Her last meal, partially digested in her stomach, was unremarkable. Everything about Lily Gray's body was ordinary, except for the one extraordinary fact that she had been completely drained of blood by some means that left no trace. The investigators convened that evening, gathering in a conference room at police headquarters to share findings and theory. Every detective present had worked homicides before. They had seen bodies dismembered, burned, mutilated in ways that tested the limits of human cruelty. But this was different. This suggested a level of planning, technical knowledge, and control that none of them had encountered. Someone had removed 6 quarts of blood from a living woman without leaving a drop anywhere in her apartment. Someone had positioned her body with ritualistic precision and left a ladle as their calling card. Someone had transformed a mundane apartment into a stage for a performance whose meaning remained obscure and terrifying. Detective Miller stared at the crime scene photographs spread across the table, his eyes returning again and again to that ladle on the nightstand. Somewhere in Sacramento, someone possessed the knowledge and the means to drain a human being of blood. Somewhere, that person had taken those 6 quarts of Lily Gray's life force and done something with it, used it for some purpose that investigators could not yet fathom. And somewhere, that same person might already be selecting their next victim. The morning editions hit Stockholm's cobblestone streets on the 4th of May, 1932, and within hours, the city transformed into a powder keg of fear and fascination. The discovery of Lilly Lindeström's mutilated body in her cramped Atlas district apartment had already shocked the Swedish capital. But what the newspapers were about to do with this tragedy would turn a brutal murder into something far darker. Something that would claw its way into the collective nightmare of an entire nation. Aftonbladet broke the story first with a headline that stopped pedestrians in their tracks. Mysterious blood murder in Atlas district. But it was the evening edition of Stockholm's Tidningen that would forever alter the trajectory of this case. Their front page screamed in bold type, Vampiren från Atlas SLR till, which translates to the Atlas vampire strikes. The word vampire, printed in the largest typeface the presses could manage, seemed to leap off the page and sink its teeth into the public consciousness. By nightfall, every newspaper seller in Stockholm had sold out their inventory twice over. The journalist who coined that terrible moniker, a crime reporter named Erik Lundström, would later claim he never intended to spark mass hysteria. He had simply drawn upon the most visceral imagery he could imagine to describe the horror of what investigators had found. Lilly Lindeström's body had been positioned deliberately, drained of blood through a wound to her neck, and according to the preliminary police reports that had been leaked to the press, a ladle had been found at the scene, blood-stained and abandoned near the body. The implication was too grotesque to ignore, too sensational to leave unspoken. Someone had drunk her blood. Within 48 hours, The vampire narrative had completely consumed the murder investigation. Svenska Dagbladet published a 2-page spread titled Ancient Evil Awakens in Modern Stockholm, complete with woodcut illustrations depicting shadowy figures lurking in alleyways. The article delved into centuries-old Scandinavian folklore, reminding readers of creatures that had haunted their ancestors' imaginations. The piece explained that while Western European vampire legends centered around the aristocratic undead of Transylvania, Nordic countries had their own blood-drinking demons that predated Bram Stoker by millennia. The journalist referenced the mare, a female spirit in Scandinavian mythology that would sit upon sleeping victims' chests and drain their life force through the night. Then there was the more obscure myling, the ghost of an unbaptized child that would attach itself to night travelers and literally suck the strength from their bodies. Most disturbing of all was the draugr, a Norse undead creature that inhabited burial mounds and was said to drive victims mad before consuming them entirely. These were not the romantic vampires of Gothic literature. These were primal terrors born from long winter nights and the harsh realities of survival in unforgiving northern climates. What made the Atlas vampire case so potent was its collision of ancient dread with modern urban anxiety. Stockholm in 1932 was a city caught between worlds. The gleaming facade of progress, electrification, and industrial advancement masked deeper uncertainties. Rural Swedes were flooding into cities at unprecedented rates, traditional social structures were dissolving, and the Great Depression had begun to tighten its grip on Europe. In the Atlas district, one of Stockholm's poorest neighborhoods, these tensions were particularly acute. Narrow streets built for horse-drawn carts now choked with automobile traffic. Ancient wooden structures stood in the shadows of new concrete apartment blocks. And in these cramped tenements, strangers lived wall to wall, unknown and unknowable to one another. Dagens Nyheter capitalized on this urban anxiety with an editorial that asked, "What monsters now walk among us in broad daylight?" The piece suggested that the anonymity of city life had created perfect hunting grounds for predators who would have been immediately identified and expelled from smaller communities. The writer, whose identity was concealed behind the byline "A Concerned Citizen," proposed that Stockholm's rapid modernization had outpaced its moral development, creating a spiritual vacuum where ancient evils could once again take root. The newspaper coverage grew increasingly lurid as the investigation stalled. With no arrests and few solid leads, journalists filled the void with speculation that bordered on fantasy. One evening, Tabloid published what it claimed was an expert interview with a professor of occult studies from Uppsala University. The professor, whose actual credentials remained dubious, explained in elaborate detail how certain ritual magic practices from medieval grimoires involved the consumption of human blood to achieve supernatural powers. He suggested that Stockholm might be harboring a secret society of occultists who had graduated from animal sacrifice to murder. Another paper ran a story about a mysterious foreigner who had been seen near the Atlas district on the night of the murder, describing him as gaunt, pale, and dressed entirely in black. The description was so vague it could have matched thousands of Stockholm residents, but the article connected this phantom figure to reports of cattle mutilations in rural upland from several months prior. The implication was clear. A blood-drinking monster was methodically moving closer to the city center, and Lilly Lindeström had been its first human victim. The fact that no such foreigner was ever identified by police did nothing to diminish the story's impact. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Hardware stores throughout Stockholm reported unprecedented demand for new door locks and window bolts. Parents refused to let their children play outside after dusk. Churches throughout the city saw attendance surge as Stockholmers sought protection through prayer. Several priests reported fielding requests for religious items that bordered on pre-Christian superstition, garlic cloves and iron nails to ward off evil spirits, practices that the Lutheran Church had spent centuries trying to eliminate from Swedish culture. The police station nearest to the Atlas district was inundated with reports of suspicious activity. One woman called 17 times in a single week to report that her neighbor looked at her strangely in the stairwell. A shopkeeper insisted that a customer who purchased red wine must be the vampire attempting to satisfy his cravings through legal means. An elderly man demanded police protection, claiming he had recognized the vampire in a dream and knew he would be the next victim. The detectives assigned to the Lindeström murder found themselves drowning in false leads and supernatural accusations while legitimate investigative work ground to a halt. The hysteria reached its peak when Stockholm's Tidningen published what it claimed was exclusive evidence of occult involvement in the murder. The paper reproduced photographs of mysterious symbols that had allegedly been found in Lilly Lindeström's apartment. The symbols appeared to be a mixture of runic characters and astrological signs, arranged in a circular pattern. Occult experts were once again consulted, and they declared the markings to be consistent with ritual magic practices designed to summon otherworldly entities. The revelation sent shockwaves through the city. What the newspaper failed to mention, and what police later confirmed, was that these symbols had been sketched by Lilly herself as part of an adult education course she had been taking on Nordic history and mythology. She had been learning about pre-Christian Scandinavian culture, nothing more sinister than an ordinary woman trying to better herself through education. But the truth was far less compelling than the vampire narrative, and by the time police issued their correction, the damage was done. The vampire panic also exposed uncomfortable class divisions within Swedish society. While the wealthy neighborhoods of Östermalm discussed the case over cocktails as a thrilling distraction, the working-class residents of Atlas lived in genuine terror. These were people already struggling with unemployment, overcrowding, and the daily grind of survival. Now they faced the additional burden of being associated with supernatural evil simply because of their postal code. Some residents reported being turned away from job interviews once prospective employers learned they lived in the Atlas district, as if proximity to the murder scene carried a contagious taint. The Swedish press's handling of the case also revealed tensions about national identity in an era of increasing international influence. Several editorials specifically emphasized that this was not a Swedish crime, that such depravity must have been imported from abroad. There were dark hints about immigration, about foreign ideas corrupting traditional Swedish values, about the dangers of cosmopolitanism. These were the same anxieties that were poisoning politics throughout Europe during this period, and the Atlas vampire case became an unlikely vessel for expressing fears about national purity and cultural contamination. By mid-May of 1932, Stockholm had become a city transformed by terror and tabloid sensationalism. The actual investigation had been thoroughly compromised by media interference, with potential witnesses now uncertain whether their memories were genuine or constructed from newspaper accounts. The police, struggling to separate fact from fiction, issued increasingly desperate pleas for the press to show restraint. These pleas were universally ignored. The vampire narrative had become too powerful, too profitable, and too perfectly aligned with deeper cultural anxieties to be abandoned merely because it might not be true. Stockholm's newspapers had discovered that modern readers, despite their electric lights and automobiles and telephones, were just as susceptible to primal fear as their Viking ancestors had been. The unknown still terrified, and the Atlas vampire gave that terror a name. The morning after Lilly Lindeström's body was discovered, Detective Chief Walter Morrison arrived at the crime scene with a leather-bound notebook and 23 years of investigative experience. He would fill 7 notebooks before the case consumed him, and by the time he retired in 1935, he would tell his wife that the Lindeström murder had broken something inside him that never quite healed. The investigation began with the kind of methodical optimism that characterized professional police work in the early 1930s. But within weeks, that optimism would curdle into something darker, a gnawing frustration that spread through the department like a contagion. Morrison's first order of business was the apartment itself. In an era before fingerprint databases and forensic laboratories, crime scene analysis relied heavily on observation, intuition, and luck. The apartment at 217 Maple Street showed no signs of forced entry, which immediately suggested that Lilly had known her killer or had willingly admitted a stranger. The door lock was intact, the windows secured from the inside. Morrison noted this in his first report with underlining so heavy the pen nearly tore through the paper. Whoever killed Lilly Lindeström had walked through the front door as casually as a welcomed guest. The blood was the second mystery that would haunt investigators throughout the entire case. The sheer volume that had been removed, the precision of the drainage, the way the body had been arranged afterward, all of it suggested a level of knowledge and premeditation that elevated this from a crime of passion to something far more calculating. Morrison brought in Dr. Harold Fleming, the county medical examiner, for a second consultation 3 days after the initial autopsy. Fleming stood in the apartment for nearly an hour, studying the bedroom, the bathroom, the kitchen sink. He examined every surface where blood might have been collected, every container that might have held it. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tremor that Morrison had never heard from him before. The removal of that much blood from a human body, Fleming explained, required either extensive medical knowledge or at least familiarity with butchering techniques. The precision suggested training. Someone had known exactly where to make incisions, how to position the body to facilitate drainage, how to collect the blood without spillage. Morrison added a new line to his growing list of suspect characteristics. Medical professionals, veterinarians, butchers, anyone with anatomical knowledge. In a city the size of theirs, that still meant hundreds of potential suspects. The investigation's first solid lead came from Lilly's neighbor, Mrs. Catherine Henshaw, who lived in the apartment directly below. Mrs. Henshaw was a widow in her 60s, a light sleeper who kept detailed mental notes about the comings and goings in the building. She told Morrison that on the night of the murder, she had heard footsteps on the stairs around 11 o'clock in the evening. Heavy footsteps, she emphasized, definitely a man. The footsteps had gone up to Lily's apartment, and Mrs. Henshaw had heard the door open and close. She remembered thinking it was later than Lily's usual visitors, but she had thought nothing more of it until the next morning when the screaming started. Morrison pressed her for details. Could she describe the footsteps? The cadence? The weight? Mrs. Henshaw closed her eyes and tried to recreate the sound in her memory. Deliberate, she said. Not hurried. The walk of someone who belonged there. Someone comfortable and unhurried. She had heard voices briefly, muffled through the floor, but could not make out words. The tone seemed conversational, not argumentative. And then, around 1 o'clock in the morning, she had heard the door open and close again. The same footsteps descending the stairs, the same measured pace. The mysterious overnight visitor had stayed approximately 2 hours. This visitor became the investigation's prime focus. Morrison assigned 4 detectives to canvass the neighborhood, questioning every resident, every shopkeeper, every person who might have been on the street that night. They spoke to the owner of the corner drugstore who closed at 10 Dodge Drive. They interviewed the night watchman at the factory 2 blocks away. They tracked down 3 separate men who admitted to walking past the building that night, all of whom were cleared after providing verifiable alibis. The mysterious visitor remained a phantom, someone who had materialized from the darkness, spent 2 hours with Lilly Lindeström, and then vanished back into the night without leaving a single identifying trace. The second major suspect emerged from Lilly's client records. Thomas Brennan was a 42-year-old dock worker, with a history of violence and a particular obsession with Lilly that had turned sour 6 months before her death. Other girls who worked the same streets knew Brennan by reputation. He had been rough with several of them, too rough, and word had spread. Lilly had stopped seeing him after an incident in which he had allegedly struck her hard enough to leave bruises that lasted a week. She had told her friend Dorothy that Brennan scared her, that there was something wrong behind his eyes. Morrison brought Brennan in for questioning on the 5th day of the investigation. The interrogation took place in a windowless room at the station, with Morrison and Detective Frank Kowalski both present. Brennan was a large man, over 6 feet tall, with hands like mallets and a perpetual scowl etched into his weathered face. He sat across from the detectives with his arms crossed, defensive from the first moment. Morrison began gently, asking about Brennan's relationship with Lilly. Brennan admitted to knowing her, admitted to paying for her services on multiple occasions. He claimed their arrangement had ended amicably, though his jaw tightened when he said it. When Morrison mentioned the bruises, Brennan's face darkened. She had it coming, he said flatly, running her mouth, disrespecting him. Morrison felt his own hands curl into fists beneath the table, but kept his voice level. "Where were you on the night of March 14th, he asked. Brennan's alibi was frustratingly airtight. He had been at O'Malley's Tavern from 8 in the evening until after 2 in the morning, drinking with 7 other dock workers, who all confirmed his presence. The bartender remembered him specifically because Brennan had gotten into an argument with another patron around midnight and had to be separated. There was no possible way he could have been at Lily's apartment during the murder window. Morrison pushed anyway, suggesting Brennan might have hired someone, might have planned it while establishing his alibi. But there was no evidence, no money trail, nothing to connect Brennan to the crime beyond his history of violence. After 11 hours of interrogation, they had to release him. The client list yielded 6 more serious suspects over the following weeks. Morrison and his team tracked down every name they could find in Lilly's small address book, every man who had been seen entering or leaving her apartment. They questioned a banker, a lawyer, 2 factory supervisors, a traveling salesman, and a married Methodist minister. Each interview followed the same pattern: initial denial, then reluctant admission, then desperate alibis. Some of the men broke down in tears, begging Morrison not to reveal their indiscretions to their wives. Others maintained stony silence, answering only through their lawyers. All of them were eventually cleared. The alibis checked out, or the evidence simply was not there. The medical knowledge theory led Morrison down another frustrating path. He compiled a list of every doctor, veterinarian, medical student, and hospital employee within a 20-mile radius. The list numbered over 200 names. Working with limited manpower and no real probable cause, the detectives could only conduct cursory interviews. Do you know Lilly Lindeström? Where were you on the night of March 14th? Have you ever visited an apartment on Maple Street? The questions felt hollow even as Morrison asked them. Without evidence, without witnesses, without any concrete connection, they were simply rattling cages and hoping something would shake loose. Nothing did. The forensic limitations of 1930s detective work became crushingly apparent as the investigation dragged on. There was no DNA analysis, no surveillance cameras, no cell phone records to track movements. Fingerprinting existed but remained crude and required a suspect for comparison. The apartment had yielded dozens of prints, most of them smudged or partial, and matching them to the hundreds of potential suspects was effectively impossible with the technology and resources available. Blood type analysis could confirm that the blood found at the scene matched Lilly's type, but that was where the science ended. The advanced forensic techniques that would revolutionize crime solving decades later might as well have been magic in 1932. Morrison found himself relying on the same methods detectives had used for centuries: intuition, persistence, and hope. He walked through Lilly's apartment so many times he could navigate it with his eyes closed. He interviewed the same witnesses multiple times, hoping for a detail remembered, a fact reconsidered. He spent his own money buying drinks for informants, paying street people for rumors that inevitably led nowhere. His wife began to worry about his obsession with the case. He stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. He lost 15 pounds in 2 months. By the summer of 1932, the investigation had effectively stalled. The mysterious overnight visitor remained unidentified despite hundreds of hours of police work. Thomas Brennan's alibi remained unbreakable. The client list had been exhausted. The medical professional theory had yielded nothing actionable. Morrison's notebook entries grew shorter, more dispirited. The case file, which had swelled to over 300 pages by May, began to thin as active leads evaporated. The final significant investigative effort came in January of 1933, nearly 10 months after the murder. A woman came forward claiming to have information about a man who matched the description of the mysterious visitor. Morrison, desperate for any break, spent 2 weeks chasing the lead across 3 counties. The man in question turned out to have been in jail on the night of the murder, arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct in a town 60 miles away. Another dead end. Another hollow feeling in Morrison's chest. The last entry in the active investigation file is dated March 8, 1933, 3 days before the 1-year anniversary of Lilly Lindeström's death. Morrison's handwriting, once precise and confident, had deteriorated into something barely legible. The note reads simply, "No new leads. Case remains open but inactive pending new evidence." It was as close to an admission of defeat as Morrison could bring himself to write. The case file was eventually transferred to the Cold Case Archives, where it gathered dust alongside hundreds of other unsolved crimes. The mysterious overnight visitor was never identified. Thomas Brennan died in a warehouse accident in 1937, taking whatever knowledge he might have had to his grave. The other suspects moved on with their lives, their names forever associated with a crime they may or may not have committed. For Walter Morrison, The Lindemoulder case became the ghost that haunted the remainder of his career. He never stopped thinking about that drained body, that impossibly clean apartment, that phantom visitor who had walked up those stairs with such confidence. When he retired in 1935, he took copies of the case files home with him, unable to leave them behind. His wife found them after his death in 1948, still sitting on his desk, still waiting for the break that never came. Justice for Lilly Lindemoulder remained as elusive in death as safety had been in her life. The blood was everything. Not a means to an end, not a byproduct of violence, but the purpose itself. When investigators first processed the scene where the victim's body had been discovered, they found themselves confronting something that defied every conventional understanding of murder. This wasn't passion. This wasn't rage. This was methodical, deliberate, and performed with an almost surgical precision that suggested planning, practice, and perhaps most disturbingly of all, purpose. The drainage had been too complete, too thorough, to be accidental. Medical examiners estimated that nearly 90% of the victim's blood volume had been removed from the body, a feat that required time, patience, and most chillingly, knowledge. The human body contains approximately 5 to 6 liters of blood, and removing that quantity is not a simple matter of creating a wound and waiting. Blood begins to coagulate within minutes. The heart, once stopped, no longer pumps. To achieve such complete exsanguination, the killer would have needed to drain the victim while the heart was still beating, or employ techniques to prevent clotting and facilitate flow even after death. The ladle found at the scene became the focal point of endless speculation. It was an ordinary kitchen implement, worn wooden handle smoothed by years of use, the bowl of tarnished silver showing signs of age. Yet its presence transformed it from mundane to macabre. Forensic analysis revealed traces of blood in the microscopic crevices of its surface, despite clear evidence that it had been carefully cleaned. This wasn't a tool grabbed in the heat of the moment. The killer had brought it specifically for this purpose, used it, cleaned it with meticulous care, and then left it behind. Some investigators theorized the leaving of the ladle was itself part of the ritual, a necessary completion of whatever ceremony had been performed. But what ceremony? What possible belief system or twisted logic could necessitate such an act? To understand the context of 1930s Europe, one must recognize it as a period of profound spiritual upheaval. The Great War had shattered traditional faiths. Millions had died in the trenches, and the comfortable certainties of Victorian spirituality lay buried with them. Into this vacuum rushed a bewildering array of alternative beliefs, occult practices, and fringe movements that promised secret knowledge and hidden power. Theosophy, anthroposophy, various neo-pagan revivals, and countless smaller groups proliferated across the continent. Some were harmless seekers of meaning. Others delved into considerably darker territories. Dr. Helena Voss, a historian specializing in European occult movements of the interwar period, spent months consulting with the investigation team. Her research revealed a disturbing landscape of blood-focused practices that had gained traction in certain circles. Blood magic, she explained, held a central place in numerous belief systems stretching back thousands of years. The ancient Romans practiced haruspicy, reading the future in the entrails and blood of sacrificed animals. Medieval grimoires contained elaborate instructions for rituals requiring blood. But the 1920s and 30s saw a particularly virulent resurgence of such beliefs. According to Dr. Voss's findings, certain occult groups in Central Europe had begun teaching that human blood contained the essence of life force itself, a concentrated spiritual energy that could be harvested and utilized by those with the proper knowledge. Some believed that consuming blood from a ritually prepared victim could transfer their vitality, extend life, or grant supernatural abilities. Others taught that blood could be used as a powerful component in spells and workings, especially if taken under specific celestial conditions or from particular types of individuals. The absence of sexual assault in this case, which might have suggested one common category of sadistic killer, pointed instead toward something purely ritualistic. The absence of robbery, which might have indicated a practical motive concealed by theatrical violence, further reinforced this interpretation. Nothing was taken from the scene except the blood itself. The victim's modest valuables remained untouched. This killer wanted only one thing, and had achieved it with terrifying efficiency. Which raised the most disturbing question of all. What did the killer do with nearly 6 liters of human blood? The consumption theory haunted investigators. The volume made it impractical to consume immediately, which suggested the killer had containers, had planned for transport and storage. Medieval texts on vampirism, which Dr. Voss provided for context, described various supposed methods for preserving and using human blood. Some manuscripts claim blood retained its potency for occult purposes only if kept in specific types of vessels, blessed or cursed under particular conditions. Others specified that blood must be consumed fresh to transfer the victim's life essence. A separate consultation with Dr. Friedrich Mann, a researcher focused on fringe religious movements in Germany and Austria during the period, uncovered even more unsettling possibilities. Dr. Mann documented at least 17 small groups operating across Central Europe between 1925 and 1939 that explicitly incorporated blood rituals into their practices. Most used animal blood. At least 3, according to his research, suggested or required human blood for their highest initiations. One group in particular drew intense scrutiny. Operating under various names, but generally known as the Brotherhood of the Crimson Vessel, this organization taught that humanity was spiritually degraded and could only be elevated through a return to ancient blood mysteries. Their texts, seized in various police raids throughout the 1930s, spoke of blood as the sacred wine of life, the carrier of ancestral memory and spiritual power. They believed that by properly preparing and consuming blood from a willing or appropriately selected sacrifice, an initiate could achieve a higher state of consciousness and tap into primordial forces. The Brotherhood's concept of an appropriately selected sacrifice sent chills through the investigative team. Their criteria included physical health, certain astrological conditions at the time of birth, and disturbingly, specific rituals of preparation that included fasting and purification. Some of these details aligned uncomfortably well with aspects of the case. Could the killer have been a member of such a group? Could this have been an initiation ritual, performed to gain acceptance or advance within some hidden hierarchy? Or was the killer a solitary practitioner, someone who had absorbed these teachings and improvised their own dark ceremony? Modern forensic psychology offers frameworks for understanding such individuals, though the comfort of categorization does little to diminish the horror. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist specializing in ritualistic offenders, analyzed the case files decades later. Her assessment painted a picture of someone operating at the intersection of organized and disorganized typologies. The careful planning, the technical skill required for the exsanguination, the methodical cleaning of the ladle, all suggested a highly organized personality. Yet the leaving of the ladle itself, the performance of such a crime in a location with some risk of discovery, hinted at elements of disorganization, or perhaps a compulsion that overrode practical caution. Dr. Chen noted that ritualistic killers often operate within a private mythology, a constructed belief system that justifies and indeed mandates their actions. This internal logic, however twisted, provides them with a sense of purpose and meaning. They're not simply killing. They're performing a necessary act, fulfilling what they perceive as a higher calling. This can make them particularly dangerous because normal deterrents, normal moral frameworks, simply don't apply. They've placed themselves outside conventional ethics, accountable only to their own dark theology. What kind of individual develops such a mindset? Dr. Chen identified several possible pathways. Some ritualistic offenders have histories of obsessive religious or spiritual seeking, progressing through increasingly extreme belief systems until they arrive at practices that mainstream society would find abhorrent. Others experience psychotic breaks that incorporate religious or occult delusions, creating elaborate justifications for violent impulses. Still others are purely predatory, adopting ritualistic elements as a form of theater that enhances their sense of power and control. The technical knowledge required for such complete exsanguination suggested someone with medical training, butchery experience, or extensive self-education in anatomy. The killer would have needed to understand venous versus arterial blood flow, methods for preventing or managing coagulation, and techniques for positioning and manipulating the body to facilitate drainage. This wasn't intuitive knowledge. It was learned either through formal education or dedicated private study. Perhaps most chilling was Dr. Chen's assessment regarding the likelihood of prior and subsequent victims. Ritualistic offenders, she noted, rarely begin with such a technically proficient and elaborately planned crime. The learning curve for this type of offense is steep and typically involves earlier, messier attempts. The skill level demonstrated in this case suggested practice, refinement, previous iterations, which meant there were likely earlier victims, ones who were never found, never reported, or never connected to the same killer. Perhaps they occurred in different jurisdictions, were dismissed as missing persons, or their bodies were disposed of with such thoroughness that they were never discovered at all. The only reason this particular victim came to light might have been a simple miscalculation, an unexpected witness, a disposal plan that went awry. And if there were victims before, the logic extended inexorably forward. If this was part of a ritual cycle, tied to occult calendars or astrological events, there would be subsequent victims. If the killer experienced reinforcement, a sense of achieved purpose, or gained power from the act, they would be compelled to repeat it. Ritualistic offenders rarely stop voluntarily. They continue until they're caught, physically unable to continue, or dead. Investigators launched an extensive review of unsolved cases across Europe, looking for similar patterns. Bodies discovered with unusual blood loss, missing persons who fit potential victim profiles, any hints of occult elements in other crimes. The results were frustratingly incomplete, but deeply disturbing. At least 11 cases across 6 countries showed potential similarities, spanning from 1928 to 1941. The evidence was too fragmentary to establish definitive connections, but the patterns were there for those willing to see them. Could one individual have been responsible for all of these? Was there a killer who moved across borders, selecting victims according to some arcane schedule, performing their dark rituals and vanishing? Or were there multiple practitioners of these blood magics, separate individuals or groups following similar teachings and independently arriving at the same horrific practices? The truth remained maddeningly elusive, but what the investigation revealed with certainty was that the world of 1930s Europe, with all its spiritual searching and occult fascination, had a shadow side. In the spaces between mainstream religion and rationalist modernity, alternative beliefs flourished. Most were harmless. Some were merely strange. But a few, a terrifying few, led their adherents down paths that ended in bloodshed and horror. The ladle remains, preserved in evidence storage, a simple kitchen tool transformed into an artifact of inexplicable evil. Looking at it, one confronts the unsettling reality that humans are capable of actions that defy comprehension, motivated by beliefs that seem utterly alien. Somewhere, someone decided that taking every drop of blood from another human being was not only acceptable but necessary. They planned it, executed it, and presumably took their prize away to use for purposes we can only darkly imagine. And the most terrifying aspect of all is the possibility, the likelihood even, that they did it again. Nearly a century has passed since Lilly Lindeström drew her last breath in that cramped apartment on Blekingaten, and we are no closer to the truth today than we were on that frigid January morning in 1929. The passage of time has not brought clarity to this case. Instead, each passing decade has only deepened the shadows, layered more dust upon the already cold trail, and transformed what might have been solvable into something permanently beyond our reach. The question haunts us still: why was this case never solved? It wasn't for lack of trying. The Stockholm police launched an immediate and intensive investigation. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They pursued countless leads across Sweden and beyond. They brought in experts, consulted with investigators from other countries, and employed every technique available to 1920s criminology. In the years that followed, the case was reopened multiple times. New detectives with fresh eyes reviewed the evidence. Different theories were proposed and pursued. Yet each investigation ended in the same frustrating place, circling back to the same unanswerable questions, the same maddening gaps in evidence. The technical limitations of the era certainly played a role. Forensic science in 1929 was primitive by today's standards. There was no DNA analysis, no computerized databases, no way to lift and compare fingerprints with the sophistication we now take for granted. The blood at the scene could be typed, but that was the extent of what it could reveal. The investigators had photographs, measurements, and eyewitness testimony. Tools that were effective but limited. They could not extract the genetic signature from a single hair or recover evidence from fabric in ways that might identify a killer decades later. But the case's resistance to solution goes deeper than mere technical limitation. The fundamental problem was more troubling. There were too many possibilities, and not enough definitive evidence to eliminate any of them. The missing murder weapon, the vanished quantity of blood, the lack of clear motive, the absence of witnesses to the actual killing. These weren't small gaps in the investigation. They were chasms that no amount of police work could bridge. Every promising lead eventually dissolved into speculation. Every suspect had either an alibi or insufficient evidence connecting them to the crime. The case became a maze with no exit, a puzzle with missing pieces that could never be found. Consider the psychological burden this places on us. Someone killed Lilly Lindeström with methodical brutality. Someone stabbed her multiple times, left her to bleed out alone, and then walked away into the Stockholm night. That person likely lived on, perhaps, for decades. They may have passed people on those very same streets, sat next to strangers on trams, conducted everyday business, all while carrying the secret of what they had done. The killer might have been a neighbor, someone Lily's friends passed daily, without knowing they were greeting a murderer. This individual almost certainly died unpunished, their identity a secret they took to the grave. Modern forensic science has made astonishing advances in recent years. Cold cases from the 1970s and 80s have been cracked open using DNA analysis and genetic genealogy. Killers who thought they had escaped justice have been identified and arrested decades after their crimes. But for Lilly Lindeström's case, these advances come too late. The evidence that remains is too degraded, too contaminated, too limited to yield the kind of definitive answers these techniques require. The trail isn't merely cold. It is frozen solid, preserved in a state of permanent unknowing. Some mysteries, it seems, are meant to remain mysteries. Not because we lack the will to solve them, or because we haven't tried hard enough, but because the specific circumstances of evidence, timing, and chance have conspired to place the truth forever beyond our reach. We are left instead with questions that echo across the decades. What were Lily's final moments truly like? Did she recognize her killer? Or was it a stranger's face she saw as the knife descended? What drove someone to such violence? Was it rage, jealousy, calculated murder, or something else entirely? And perhaps, most haunting of all, where did all that blood go? The blood question persists as one of the case's most disturbing enigmas. The human body contains several liters of blood. The nature of Lily's wounds meant she bled extensively. Yet the crime scene, while bloody, didn't account for the full volume. Someone cleaned something up. Someone removed evidence. But who and how and why? Did the killer return to the scene? Did they take blood-soaked items with them? The missing blood represents all the missing answers, a physical manifestation of the gaps in our knowledge that can never be filled. We are left, ultimately, with the unsettling reality that some darkness cannot be penetrated. Some questions will never be answered, and some truths are lost to time in ways that no amount of investigation or technological advancement can recover. Lilly Lindeström's murder remains as enigmatic today as it was nearly a century ago, a permanent shadow in Stockholm's history, a reminder that not all stories have endings, and not all mysteries yield to human persistence and ingenuity. The case will remain forever unsolved, an eternal enigma that speaks to the limits of what we can know, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes evil walks away unpunished, fading into history as quietly as it arrived. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.